The crowd was not an accident. That is the thing nobody tells you when they talk about Roman public punishment. Every account you have ever read, every textbook chapter, every documentary, every dramatization, treats the crowd as background, as context, as the Roman equivalent of a set dressing, placed there to indicate that this was a public event and therefore more dramatic than a private one. That reading is wrong, and it is wrong in a way that changes everything about how you understand what Rome was actually doing when it executed a slave on the Appian Way. The crowd was not an audience. The crowd was the mechanism. Here is what I mean. Rome in the Imperial period, the Rome of Augustus, of Tiberius, of Nero, of the emperors whose names you know, was a city of somewhere between 1 and 2 million people, depending on which historian's estimate you trust and which decade you're examining. 1 to 2 million people in a pre-industrial urban environment, governed by a state apparatus that had no police force in the modern sense, no standing domestic security service, no capacity to monitor individual behavior at the granular level that modern states take for granted. What Rome had instead was something considerably older and considerably more effective. It had the eyes of every person in the city, and it had, through 2 centuries of deliberate psychological engineering, trained those eyes to do exactly what the state needed them to do. Start with a question that Roman legal scholars asked explicitly and that modern historians have examined with increasing sophistication over the past 50 years. Why was Roman punishment public? The obvious answer, the one that comes first, is deterrence. If people see what happens to those who break the law, they will be less likely to break the law themselves. This is the standard explanation. It is not wrong, but it is approximately 20% of the actual answer, and the 80% that gets left out is where the real machinery lives. The Roman jurist Aulus Gellius, writing in the 2nd century CE, recorded a distinction that Roman legal thinking drew between 2 categories of punishment. The first category was Poena, punishment as penalty, as consequence, as the state's response to a specific act. The second was supplicium, punishment as ritual, as public performance, as a communication addressed not to the person being punished, but to everyone watching. Crucifixion was always supplicium. Always. The legal texts are consistent on this point across centuries of Roman jurisprudence. When Rome crucified a slave on the Appian Way, it was not administering a penalty to that specific slave for that specific offense. It was performing a ritual whose audience was the entire Roman world. This distinction sounds philosophical. It had concrete consequences for how the punishment was designed, where it was carried out, how long it lasted, and what was required of everyone present. Required. That word matters. Let's examine it. In Roman public punishment, attendance was not voluntary for certain categories of people. Slaves belonging to the household of a condemned slave were, in documented cases, brought to witness the execution of their fellow slave whether they wished to be present or not. This practice is recorded in several Roman sources and defended in legal commentary with a logic that is worth understanding precisely. The argument made explicitly by Roman legal writers was this: a slave who had not witnessed the execution of another slave for the same category of offense could not be expected to have fully internalized the cost of that offense. Knowledge of the punishment, communicated secondhand, was insufficient. The body needed to be present, the eyes needed to see, the ears needed to hear. Only direct sensory experience of what the punishment looked and sounded and smelled like, and Roman sources are specific about all 3, created the kind of deep, embodied understanding that the state required. This was not a casual assumption. It reflected a genuine and sophisticated Roman understanding of how fear actually works in human psychology, and it was an understanding that modern neuroscience has largely confirmed. We now know that witnessing another person's suffering activates neural systems in the observer that produce a partial simulation of that experience. The body of the witness is not passive. It participates. It registers the event at a level below conscious processing, in systems older than language, that produce lasting behavioral changes that purely intellectual knowledge of the same event cannot produce. The Romans did not have the vocabulary of neuroscience, but they had 2 centuries of empirical observation of what public punishment did to the people who watched it, and they had built their system accordingly. The specific design of Roman public execution, the location, the timing, the duration, the route of the procession, becomes comprehensible once you understand that the primary audience was not the condemned person. The condemned person was the message. The crowd was the recipient. Consider the timing. Roman public executions and floggings were held in the middle of the day at the busiest hours in the most trafficked locations the city offered: the Forum, the major roads, the circus, in some periods, not at dawn when the streets were empty, not at night when visibility was limited, at noon when the maximum possible number of eyes were available to receive the message. Consider the duration. Death by crucifixion, as Script 1 documented, could take hours or days. This was not an unfortunate side effect of the method. It was a design feature. A death that took hours kept the message visible for hours. Every person who walked past the Appian Way during those hours received the communication that the state was sending. A quick death, a beheading, a strangling, sent the message once to the people who happened to be present at the moment of death. A slow death sent it continuously to rotating audiences over an extended period. The logistics of the message were built into the physiology of the punishment. Consider the route of the procession. The condemned man was not taken from the prison to the execution site by the most direct path. He was taken by the most public path, through the Forum, past the temples, along the streets where the crowds were thickest. The route was a communication strategy. Every segment of it was chosen because of who would see it. The Roman scholar Valerius Maximus, writing in the 1st century CE, described the purpose of public punishment with unusual directness for a Roman writer on this subject. He wrote that the sight of punishment did to the observer what no speech could do, that it reached parts of the mind that argument and instruction could not access. He was describing, in the vocabulary available to him in the 1st century, what we would now call the difference between declarative memory and procedural or emotional memory, between knowing something and having it written into your body. Rome had understood empirically that the second kind of knowledge was more durable and more reliable as a behavioral control mechanism than the first, and it had built its entire public punishment system around producing that second kind of knowledge in the maximum possible number of people. Now here is where it gets considerably more disturbing, because the crowd was not only the recipient of the message, the crowd was also, through its presence and its response, an active participant in the production of the message. This requires explanation. Roman public punishment depended on the crowd's reaction for a specific part of its psychological effect, not the jeering, though the jeering was real and documented and served its own function. Something more structural than that. The crowd's presence transformed the punishment from an act of state violence into a collective social judgment. A condemned man flogged or crucified in private was a man being hurt by the government. A condemned man flogged or crucified before a crowd that watched and did not intervene was a man being hurt by his entire community. The distinction, psychologically, was enormous, both for the person being punished and for the slaves and lower-status free persons watching. If 1,000 people stand and watch a man being destroyed and no one moves to stop it, what does that communicate? It communicates consensus. It communicates that the community, represented by everyone present, agrees that this is happening correctly, that the person being punished deserves what is happening, that the social order being enforced is legitimate. This is why Roman authorities were so attentive to crowd management at public executions, not because they feared rescue attempts, though they guarded against those too, but because a crowd that showed visible distress at a punishment, a crowd that turned away or expressed grief or sympathy, was failing to perform its required function. The crowd was supposed to watch. It was supposed to be present. And in its presence and its watching, it was supposed to ratify the event. A crowd that didn't ratify undermined the entire purpose of the exercise. The Roman writer Seneca, who appears throughout this series because he is one of the few Roman intellectuals who noticed what he was seeing and found it worth examining rather than simply accepting, wrote about this dynamic with a discomfort that is unusual in Roman literature on the subject. He wrote about attending public spectacles and finding himself, against his own intentions, caught up in the crowd's response. He wrote that the crowd's emotion was contagious in a way that disturbed him. that he had gone to these events intending to observe with philosophical detachment and had found that detachment impossible to maintain once he was surrounded by people whose bodies were responding collectively to what they were witnessing. He used this experience to make an argument about the influence of crowds on individual behavior. But embedded in his argument is something more specific, a description of how collective witnessing of public punishment worked at the level of individual human psychology. He describes a process by which the individual, surrounded by others who are responding to the same event, begins to respond not only to the event itself, but to the others' responses. The crowd becomes a feedback loop. Each person's response amplifies the responses of those around them, which amplifies their own response further. Rome had not engineered this dynamic deliberately. It was an emergent property of gathering large numbers of humans together to watch something emotionally charged. But Roman authorities had observed it operating across generations of public punishment and had designed their events to maximize it. Large crowds, not small ones. Central public locations, not peripheral ones. Long durations, not brief ones. Everything that amplified the collective response was preserved in the design. Everything that dampened it was removed. There is a category of Roman public punishment that deserves specific examination within this psychological framework because it illustrates the principles most starkly. It is the punishment that Roman sources call summum supplicium in its most extreme form, reserved for the most severe category of offense a slave could commit: the murder of a master. Under the Senatus Consultum Silanianum, a law passed in 10 CE and repeatedly confirmed and extended across the imperial period, if a master was murdered by a slave, every slave in the household, regardless of their personal involvement, regardless of their proximity to the crime, regardless of any evidence against them as individuals, was subject to execution, every one of them. The law was not secret, it was publicly known, it was intended to be publicly known, and its logic was explicit in the legal commentaries that explained it. A master, alone in a house with dozens of slaves, was always potentially vulnerable. The only thing standing between him and the combined force of every enslaved person in his household was the knowledge, held by every one of those people, that if anything happened to him, every one of them would die. This was deterrence at a scale that individual punishment could not achieve. It created a structure in which every slave in a household had a direct personal interest in the master's survival, not out of loyalty or affection, but out of the coldest possible calculation about their own continued existence. And it was public. The executions following a master's murder were public events, carried out with maximum visibility, attended by the largest possible audiences, because the message was not addressed to the household of the murdered master. That household was already gone. The message was addressed to every other slave in every other Roman household who heard about what had happened and what followed. The historian Tacitus documented one specific application of this law: the execution of the 400 slaves belonging to the murdered city prefect Pedanius Secundus in 61 CE, in terms that make the public response to it unusually visible. There were protests, not from slaves, they had no legal voice, but from Roman citizens who gathered at the Senate and argued against the mass execution on grounds of proportionality and humanity. The Senate debated it, seriously, at length, and then voted to carry out the executions anyway. Tacitus records the speech of the senator Gaius Cassius, who argued for proceeding. And the argument Cassius made was not about justice in any sense a modern person would recognize, it was purely systemic. He argued that if the law were suspended in this case, if the crowd of Roman citizens gathered outside the Senate managed to prevent this specific application of this specific rule, then the rule would be weakened. And a weakened rule would produce a different calculation in every slave in every Roman household from that point forward. And a different calculation in those slaves would produce a different Rome, a Rome that could not safely turn its back on the people who served it, cooked its food, raised its children, and outnumbered its citizens. The executions were carried out publicly. The 400 were marched through Rome under military guard to the site of execution. Tacitus writes that soldiers had to line the route because the crowd of citizens who had protested in the Senate had been joined by others, and the authorities feared disruption, not rescue. They had enough soldiers for that. Disruption, the crowd reacting in the wrong way, failing to ratify. In the end, the crowd watched. As crowds in Rome had been trained to watch, across generations, through the accumulated weight of everything Rome had made visible and public and witnessed and collective. They watched, and by watching, they participated, and the system continued. Seneca, who has appeared throughout this script because he cannot seem to stop noticing things that other Roman writers walk past, wrote one final observation worth ending on. He wrote, in a letter that is studied by classicists and rarely read by anyone else, that the worst thing about Roman public punishment was not what it did to the person being punished. It was what it did to the people watching. He had observed, he wrote, that men who attended these spectacles regularly became different men. Not more frightened, he might have expected that, and found it defensible as a mechanism of social order. Different in a way that troubled him more. Coarser, more comfortable with suffering, less able to feel the weight of what they were witnessing, as if the repeated exposure to public pain had worn something smooth in them that had once had texture. He was describing, in the vocabulary of a first-century Stoic philosopher, something that modern psychologists call desensitization, the process by which repeated exposure to disturbing stimuli gradually reduces the emotional response to those stimuli. The nervous system's protection mechanism against overwhelming input, which, deployed at scale across a population, across generations, produces exactly the kind of crowd that Rome needed. A crowd that could watch without being destabilized by what it was watching. A crowd that could ratify without the ratification costing them anything they could feel. Rome had not planned this outcome. It was an emergent property of a system designed for other purposes. But it served those purposes so well that the system preserved it across centuries, refined it, exported it to every province of the empire, and defended it against every legal and philosophical challenge, including Seneca's, with the patient confidence of a mechanism that knew it worked. The crowd was not an accident. The crowd was the point, and the crowd, over time, became exactly what Rome needed it to be. What Romans did to slaves before crucifixion was more brutal than you imagine. The crowd was not an accident. Every account you have ever read treats the Roman crowd at a public execution as background, as context, as set dressing that indicates this was a public event and therefore more dramatic than a private one. That reading is completely wrong. The crowd was not an audience. The crowd was the mechanism. Rome in the Imperial period had no police force in the modern sense, no domestic security service, no capacity to monitor individual behavior at scale. What it had instead was something considerably older and considerably more effective, the trained eyes of every person in the city. And through 2 centuries of deliberate psychological engineering, Rome had made those eyes do exactly what the state needed them to do. In this video, episode 2 of the Roman series, we go inside the psychology of Roman public punishment, why the crowd was required, not optional, why slaves were forced to witness the execution of other slaves, what the Roman jurist Aulus Gellius meant when he distinguished between Poena and supplicium, what happened to the 400 slaves of Pedanius Secundus in 61 CE, and what the Senate debate that preceded it reveals about what Rome was actually afraid of, and what Seneca noticed at the end of a life spent watching about what repeated exposure to public suffering did to the people who watched it. The cross was the message. The crowd was the delivery system.